Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. As I've mentioned in a recent video, I've recently reinstalled Falcon BMS 4.34 and I've been undertaking the task of getting back up to speed with that sim platform. I'm not going to get into the details about why I'm adding BMS back into my life right now. I've covered that in a previous video which I'll link on screen and in the description below. To be clear, I still fly both sims. I love both BMS and DCS for different reasons, and so I'll continue to fly both sims. BMS has a pretty steep learning curve, and when viewing it from the outside, if you're new to BMS, it can often appear a bit opaque. But in my journey back to Falcon BMS, I've discovered several resources that have helped me immeasurably by shedding light into that murky darkness. And so with this video, I thought I would let you know about some of those resources that I've found in the hopes that they can help you if you're trying to get back into BMS and don't really know where to start. I will state very clearly now, though, I am in no way an expert on BMS. In fact, I'm the opposite. I'm just getting back into the sim. This video is just a bit of detail about what I've learned over the past few weeks and some of the lessons that I've learned, often the hard way, in the hopes that you don't make the same mistakes. Firstly, before we get into the detail, I should talk a little bit about some of the key differences between the two simulators. Both DCS and BMS are both combat flight simulators, and so there are some immediate similarities. They both enable you to take off in an aircraft, employ weapons against foes in the air and on the ground, and land back at base for tea and medals. But while there are certainly similarities, there are also some significant differences, and I'll allude to some of those differences here. Firstly, graphics. The graphics in DCS are excellent. As a sim, there are times when I look at the screen and my jaw unconsciously hangs open. It really is breathtaking at points. This is specifically true, or especially true, on the more modern Persian Gulf map. It's absolutely stunning. On top of that, the aircraft models are visually excellent, the texturing is fantastic, and the sim has access to some very contemporary graphical technologies, things like bump mapping and ray tracing. I will quite often find myself having a very visceral reaction to the graphics in DCS, especially when watching an explosion on the ground or in the air. It looks real. BMS, on the other hand, is not bad graphically, but it certainly is showing its age when compared to DCS. The visuals are sharp on my 4K monitor to a degree, but the textures aren't great. The land mesh is quite obviously based on a low granularity block template. And while the developers of BMS have tried to mask that block mesh to a degree, the ground mesh, especially on the coastlines, looks a bit like Minecraft sometimes. The satellite imagery-based approach to ground texturing works from 20,000 feet. When you're on the ground, though, the textures aren't great at all. Again, it's a 22-year-old sim, and there's only so much that the guys at BMS can do to overcome those limitations in technology associated with a platform that's this old. Next, we should talk about content generation because there's quite a significant philosophical difference between the way that DCS and BMS approach the generation of content for users. DCS is, in my opinion, more of a sandbox, and the modding community have largely stepped in to fill the content void that DCS has. This is especially true in multiplayer. This lack of producer-created and curated content is, in my opinion, the biggest shortcoming of DCS. If it had a genuine dynamic campaign similar to that of BMS, I believe it would be unstoppable as a sim platform. Now, in terms of BMS, well, I'll speak a little bit more about BMS's approach to content generation in a moment, but suffice it to say, its ability to generate huge variability of fun content for its users is incredible, still 22 years after its release. Thirdly, let's talk about model variety. If you're used to switching from aircraft to aircraft in DCS, 1 minute in the A-10, the next in the KA-50, then switching to the Hornet, you will likely be disappointed in BMS. Don't get me wrong, BMS has other aircraft you can fly, other non-F-16 aircraft, including some of the ones that you get in DCS, like the Hornet or the Harrier. But the core of Falcon 4.0 is built around the F-16, and it is in flying the F-16 that you will find, in my opinion, the best user experience, as those other modules are more of a skin of the F-16 core. I believe the flight models are different from aircraft to aircraft, but certainly the avionics and systems of all of the jets in BMS are at its core the F-16 avionics, no matter what aircraft you're flying. Now, this day and age, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about VR. As it stands right now, there is no native support for VR in BMS. If you want to have a high fidelity combat flight sim experience in VR, DCS is still your best bet. I believe there are workarounds for BMS, but I think it's pretty much a hack to get it kind of forced into VR. All of this said, I want to be completely transparent here and say that I don't have a VR setup, and so if I'm talking out of my ass here, somebody please let me know. We should spend a second talking about realism. I think there are some people that would say that BMS is more quote unquote realistic and accurate than DCS. Now listen, I'd love to have an opinion on this, but I don't. The reason why is because I can in no way be considered an expert on combat flight sim realism, as I've never flown an F-16 in combat. My 4.8 hours of flight sim instruction on a Cessna 152 does not make me an expert here, so I'll spare you my view from the cheap seats opinions on this. Now, this all boils down to the fact that I believe the main difference between the two flight sims is really philosophical. DCS is more focused on a more visceral, tactical experience, while BMS is much grander and more strategic in scope and scale. Now, having heard all of that, you might be asking yourself, why would I make the jump to a much older, less polished combat flight simulator when I can use the more modern, visually attractive option? Certainly, when you look at DCS and BMS on paper, you'd think that DCS is the hands-down winner and thus more worthy of your attention. But at least for me, there are some reasons to make the jump to BMS. There are pros and cons of both sims. Both are great in their own way and are fun, albeit again in different ways. And what I'd say is that everybody will have their own reasons for wanting to try and add some variety to their combat flight sim experience, or not. And so all I can do is let you know the reasons why I chose to add BMS to my combat flight sim stable. For me, it comes down to three key reasons. Firstly, content. While I greatly appreciate the content created by the DCS multiplayer community, I believe that DCS is more of a combat flight simulator sandbox than a combat flight simulator itself. I think DCS is great at simulating battles, but terrible at simulating war. Owing to its amazing campaign engine, BMS is second to none at creating war between belligerent states, in this case, South Korea and North Korea, although there are other theaters available. Secondly is immersion. As a result of that awesome warfare engine in BMS, the immersion I feel in BMS is immense. When that campaign is running, I absolutely feel like a small cog in a big wheel. And that's a really cool feeling. Not better or worse than the more tactical feeling of DCS, just different. And it's not just the campaign engine. The ATC in BMS is far more accurate than DCS. Mission planning is much more of a thing in BMS. And you have full access to the data cartridge, which I know when I say it sounds like a silly thing to point out as a positive, but it really does add to the sense of immersion that you get with BMS. Thirdly, and very importantly, is stability. BMS is a much more mature product, and thus the stability of the sim is rock solid. I've experienced very few issues in BMS, and I know that some of the issues that were introduced in the original release of 4.34 have broadly been fixed in the incremental updates that have been released since. DCS, on the other hand, is much less stable, especially on the official beta of branch code. Don't get me wrong, the clients of DCS benefit from that instability. Those of us who fly and fight in BMS, we benefit from that instability, as it's a reflection of the fact that Eagle Dynamics are constantly working on advancing the sim for the benefit of everybody involved. That's a good thing. But sometimes I don't want the hassle of instability. I just want something that is going to work every time I double click on the icon. And BMS is that stable granite rock that I can lean back on. So you've heard a few of the differences between the two simulators, and if you're still thinking BMS is something that you want to get into, then you might be asking yourself, what do you need to get started? It's pretty simple, really. All you need to get started is a legitimate original version of Falcon 4.0 and the BMS Total Conversion update. Now, regarding the official copy, if you bought BMS all those years ago, back in 1998, and still have the disk, awesome. Just use that and put a fresh install on your hard drive. If you don't, you can buy a digital download version from either Steam or another download service called Good Old Games. It's not expensive. £4.99 sterling here in the UK is all it costs, and I guess it's equally inexpensive in other geographic regions. Then you need the latest version of BMS. At the time of recording, June 2020, the latest version of BMS is 4.34. This can be downloaded from the benchmarksims.org forums. I'll put a link in the description below. You'll need to register for the forums to make sure that you can access the download. Now, a few weeks back when I installed BMS 4.34, I made a bit of a mistake. I immediately started flying based on the 4.34 kind of base build. I'd highly recommend that you don't make the same mistake that I did. I'd recommend that you immediately download and install the 4 incremental updates that are available for 4.34 and install those updates before you start flying. They add some new features and fix some of the issues that were there in the base 4.34 build. I'd highly recommend that you closely follow the instructions on how to install the incremental updates, as there is some nuance there. On both the core BMS 4.34 download and the incremental updates, I'd really recommend that you use the torrent links for them, as your download will be a lot faster, and then once you're done downloading, you'll be serving the community with their download. If you don't want to use the torrent links, though, there are direct download links available, but if I were you, if you were using that setup, I'd set the download up and go for a coffee, as it's going to take a while. That's all you need to get started, but there are a few other resources I'd recommend you get a hold of and use, as they'll make your life simpler and easier. First up is something called the Alternative Launcher. Now, BMS has a standard kind of launcher package which you can use to configure many aspects of the sim. The Alternative Launcher is just a more contemporary version of that launcher. But it's not just a reskin. There are new functions added as well, the most important of which is an ability to configure your input devices outside of the sim environment. Now, if you've ever tried to configure input devices inside of Falcon's native 2D interface, you'll know when I say that it is absolutely miserable, and you really should be using the Alternative Launcher to set up your input devices. There are also 2 software programs that I'd really recommend that you download. The first is called Mission Commander. It's a piece of software that enables you to configure any element of a campaign save file. It's really useful if you want to do things like change airframes in a squadron or move a squadron from one airbase to another. It's stuff like that. The second, and probably more important of the 2, is something called Weapon Delivery Planner. And it's something that's used to provide a quick kind of aid memoir for your flight, for your fragged package. Everything from takeoff time to weather, comms frequencies, loadouts, etc. Now, there's too much detail to get into in this video, so I'll just recommend them both and leave them there. I might do a video for them later on, though. Now, in terms of peripherals, the good news is that there is support for most input devices straight out of the gate with BMS. So if your joystick or rudder pedals or head tracker works in DCS, it will probably work in BMS as well, with the obvious exception to this being the VR that I mentioned before. I know that there are some restrictions in BMS regarding the number of axes and hat switches that BMS will recognize, but this really isn't a limitation that's impacted me negatively yet. Right, so you've got Falcon installed, you've got BMS installed and the incremental updates, you've got Weapon Delivery Planner installed and Mission Commander and the Alternative Launcher. All that's installed and running, but you're really only just reaching base camp. The mountain still needs climbing. The good news is that, like a faithful Sherpa, there are tons of resources available to help you reach that summit. Yes, I realize I'm killing this analogy. First, BMS itself comes with a ton of written documentation to help you get up to speed. If you navigate to your BMS installation directory, you'll find a folder there, a subfolder called Docs. In this folder is a huge plethora of documentation given to you by the BMS team. The variety of manuals alone is incredible. You've got a flight manual, avionics and non-nuclear weapon delivery manual, a technical manual, a user manual for BMS itself, a comms and navigation manual. There's even real United States Air Force manuals to flick through. Now, many of these manuals number hundreds of pages. So while you can read them cover to cover, what I'd recommend is that you use them as a reference guide to look up specific topics like avionics management or weapon systems employment, etc. In the docs folder, you'll also find airport charts, checklists. You'll even find helpful profiles for track IR and voice attack if you use those systems. But the docs folder in and of itself can seem a bit overwhelming. There's so much information in there that it can often feel like you're trying to drink from a fire hose. That's where the second, and in my opinion, the best resource available comes in, and that is the Falcon Lounge channel on Discord. The Falcon Lounge is the largest and most active community hub for BMS. Here you'll be able to connect and engage with some of the most knowledgeable thought leaders for BMS outside of the BMS team itself. I've posed some simple questions in there or some complex questions, and they're always answered helpfully and almost immediately. Every one of the questions that I've asked on that channel has been answered inside of a minute, which is incredibly helpful. Not only are people there to come together and chat about BMS and help each other, Falcon Lounge also hosts multiplayer events, hosts a team versus team PvP server, and even has a fully curated academy where you can enroll as a student and graduate having learned the basics of how to fly and fight in BMS. How cool is that, right? Now, if you're anything like me, reading how to do something is fine. Even talking to somebody about it can help. But to really learn quickly, I need to see it in action. So the third resource I'd signpost for you is YouTube itself. There are tons of very helpful and useful tutorials available for you to learn what you need. There are dozens of people who have put videos up, and you can throw yourself open to the mercy of the YouTube search function. But I found that there are 3 YouTube channels that I find myself going back to over and over and over. And so I thought I'd point those 3 out to you. First is a dude named Kraus. Now, Kraus has obviously been flying BMS for a long time. I'm pretty sure he's still active, as I see him in the Falcon Lounge quite a lot. But about 7 or 8 years ago, Kraus released a ton of BMS tutorials to help people learn about the systems in Falcon BMS. I'm pretty sure they were for Falcon 4.32 at the time, but many, if not most of the videos are still relevant today, and I'd highly recommend them to anybody who wants to learn about how to fly the F-16 in BMS. Secondly is Supernova. Supernova's videos are a bit newer than Kraus's, I believe. I think most of them use BMS 4.33 as their platform. Now, Supernova has a very level and clear delivery style that I find really useful. And again, I find myself on his YouTube channel a lot. Third and finally is a guy named Max Waldorf. Now, I'm pretty sure Max is one of the driving forces behind Falcon Lounge. I'm not certain, but I believe that to be the case. So he's obviously a guy who is hugely passionate about BMS and is happy to give his knowledge and experience and expertise back to the BMS community, which is really cool. I tend to use his channel more for the non-jet handling elements of BMS. He's got an excellent video, for example, on how to get started in a campaign. Again, another amazing channel. Now, all of these channels, I'm going to link to them in the description below, so check out down below. Now, I can assure you, there are going to be moments when you are about to rage quit the sim because you've been, trying unsuccessfully to bore sight your Mavericks to the TGP for the 180th time. I'd implore you, don't give up. Instead, go visit the YouTube channels of either Loric Iolme or Unleashed Code. I'll provide links in the description below to both of their channels. Both of these guys are legends in the BMS community, and their channels are 2 of the main reasons why I've chosen to get stuck into BMS. These guys are BMS experts, and watching them fly missions on YouTube provides sterling testimony to what this sim is capable of when its entire potential is unleashed. Watching them individually is fun, but even more exciting is when the 2 of them decide to get together and fly a flight together. It, in my opinion, is the visual embodiment of what excellent virtual flight coordination looks like, and is the pinnacle of what I aspire to achieve within BMS. That's it for this video, folks. I'm sorry that it's been a bit of a marathon, but I wanted to make sure that I was letting you know about all of the lessons that I've learned, often by making mistakes, over the past few weeks on my pilgrimage to BMS. I hope you found it useful. Let me know in the comments below if you think there's anything I've missed or I've gotten wrong. That's it for me. Samurai out.